And turning back to the developing big news today, The Guardian newspaper in the UK reporting that Donald Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, held secret meetings with Julian Assange inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London several times, including during the 2016 campaign. Joining me now, Corey Lewandowski, Donald Trump's first campaign manager, who was replaced by Manafort. He's also co-author of the new book, Trump's Enemies: How the Deep State is Undermining the Presidency, which comes out today. And Corey, thank you for joining us. Congratulations on your new book.
Thank
written
you.
With David Bossie. First of all, were you ever aware before this, before The Guardian's reporting, that Paul Manafort had met in the past with Julian Assange in that Ecuadorian embassy where he's holed up as part of his asylum?
Yeah, Andrea, I've never been made aware of that. I read about it today for the first time like everybody else. But just a critical point, and it's a minor point. Paul Manafort was never the campaign manager, just to be clear.
No, that's right.
He was the campaign chairman, which is two very different titles, just to be clear.
Absolutely.
But that being said, I had no knowledge of it. Paul never told me of that, if he did do that. And I'll take the reporting for what it's worth. We know where Paul is. I'm sure we can find him if we need to get in touch with him. We know exactly how to find him right now. But I have no idea if that report is true or not, but it wouldn't surprise me.
The plea deal that has blown up now, with both sides agreeing that it's broken, and now they're going to proceed to a sentencing, pre-sentencing hearing and all the rest. The allegation from Mueller is that Manafort lied. The allegation from the other side is that he didn't lie. Who do you think is telling the truth between Robert Mueller and Paul Manafort?
Well, look, if I had to put my money on one of those two, knowing Paul Manafort the way I do, I'd probably put my money on the other side right now, because Paul Manafort is a serial liar. He lies about the smallest things. He lies about the biggest things. So, look, I think Paul's going to be a guy who spends the rest of his life in jail, or the rest of his natural life in jail, one way or the other, whether it's the 10 years that he's pled to, for things which are very important to know, for things that transpired prior to him ever coming to the Trump organization or the Trump campaign. All of the things that Paul has pled guilty to and has been convicted of took place during his international consulting roles overseas, his tax evasion, his money laundering, all of those other things had nothing to do with his role when he was serving as a chairman of the Trump campaign for about a 12-week window. So, look, did he lie to the special counsel? I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Do you think he should be pardoned?
Look, I don't think there's any reason to pardon Paul Manafort, but it's not my decision. It's a decision the president will make. But again, the crimes that Paul has not only pled guilty to, but also has been found guilty of through a jury trial, are things like tax evasion and money laundering, things that are fairly easy to prove, but have nothing to do with his tenure during his time working for the Trump campaign.
But do you think that he, as some allege, is blowing up this deal or continuing to lie, as has been alleged by Mueller, because he does know he's got a safety net? Certainly the president is expressing sympathy for him now.
Well, look, I don't think so. I don't think there's any safety net. Look, do I think that Paul Manafort has been treated differently than other people who've committed similar crimes? Yes, I do. Do I think that he deserves to be in solitary confinement for an extended period of time? No, I don't. But that being said, there is no safety net that I know of. I've never heard the president say that he had any interest in pardoning Paul Manafort for any of his crimes. And many of his crimes, as you know, are not just federal crimes, but also state crimes, of which the president cannot pardon. So that being said, Paul Manafort is going to go to jail. He's going to go to jail for a long time. And the question is really a matter of equity. Has Paul been treated in the same manner that other people who are white-collar criminals have been treated? Look, I'm not a fan of Paul Manafort, clearly. I don't think he's been treated fairly in that regard, but he has pled guilty to a series of those crimes, and he has been found guilty by a jury of his peers. And Paul has been in jail now for the better part of 5 months and will probably remain there for the next, decade.
In your first book, and we're going to get to Trump's enemies in a moment, in your first book, you wrote of an incident after the New York Times was about to break the story. Steve Bannon had learned that the Times was about to break the story of all the money, millions and millions of dollars, more than $12 million, that Manafort had supposedly taken in representing the former leader of Ukraine and others connected to Russia. And the president was told about this, was told about the Times book, and you wrote in that first book that the president said, "I've got a crook running my campaign."
No, that's exactly right. Look, we know that Donald Trump is very judicious with his money. The campaign was run very judiciously under my watch, and Paul pretended to be something he wasn't. He pretended to be this rich aristocrat who had homes in the Hamptons and all these other places, and he pretended to be a contemporary of the president, both in age and in financial stature. And what we've found out since that time, it was all a farce. He was mortgaged to the hills. He was basically running a Ponzi scheme. He was hiding money offshore. And when that was discovered and uncovered by the New York Times and other reports, Paul basically was fired right after that, because what we know is Paul tried to get money from the campaign. I wrote about this in the book, that Paul tried to get money from the campaign. He volunteered on the campaign, but found other ways to try and get the campaign to cover his expenses because he was basically broke.
I got to ask you, in Trump's enemies, you write about some of the people who you think are undercutting the president. What is your main beef with Chief of Staff John Kelly?
Well, John and I have two very different management styles, and I believe that the president is best, like we saw last night. When he's out in front of the public, he's talking directly to the American people, and others think different of that. Others think that he is best when they are protecting the American people from the president, and I fundamentally disagree with that. In the book, Let Trump Be Trump, I said you have to let him be who he is, and it seems to be that every person who comes in a senior capacity around the president wants to redefine how he does things when his way of doing it has worked, whether it's in New York real estate or television or in the world of politics. So, look, let Donald Trump go out and talk to the people. Let him talk to the press. I think you'd like to see him talking to the press as much as possible. And that's where I think we have a fundamental disagreement. And my conversations with people in the building have always surrounded what I think is best for the president, which is putting him more forward-facing.
Corey, did you and Kelly actually come into a physical situation where he grabbed you or you grabbed him outside the Oval Office and the Secret Service had to intervene, as was reported October 22nd in the New York Times by Maggie Haberman and others?
Well, the Secret Service didn't intervene to break up a fight, and I think what I can say about that is my conversations with John are very candid and very forthright, probably similar to the conversations that he had with the president. And some are heated and some are private, and I'm going to keep those private, but I think there's no question that John knows that I am a steadfast supporter of the president. Externally, whether it's on television, through op-eds. And if I have a disagreement or I don't think the president's being told what I think he needs to know, then I'm willing to let people know that, and sometimes that bothers people.
And do you think that Kelly should be fired and replaced, and if so, by whom?
You know, I don't know. That's clearly a decision that the president is going to make as he starts to look forward to his own reelection effort in 2020. You know, I want to make sure that he has the best political team around him. Historically speaking, when you see chiefs of staff like Jim Baker or Rahm Emanuel, you know, their core competency was elections, understanding the political climate, and John Kelly has been a chief of staff who understands policy and procedure, and that was necessary for a period of time. Going into a re-election effort for the president, you know, I may think that he would want to make some changes, not just in his administration, but also at his cabinet level.
What about Nick Ayers?
Very capable individual. I know Nick well, have worked with him. Nick is a very competent individual who understands politics and policy. He's wise beyond his years. And if he is chosen, and that's the president's decision, I would absolutely support that. But I would support anybody the president chose, including John Kelly, if he wants to keep him.
Corey Lewandowski, thank you very much. The book with your co-author, David Bossie, is Trump's Enemies. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.